I'd like to tell you a little bit, well, I won't tell you the story about how I found that envelope. I was doing research at Morristown in their collection, and they didn't know they had it. This evening, I'd like to share a Masonic subject with you that I enjoy and that I'd like to share with you in a library and a museum that I also enjoy. I was raised a Mason the year I graduated from college. That was quite a while ago, in my father's lodge in Garden City, New York. However, I had 9 months before I went into the service. So I was in New York waiting to go into the service. And I went down to my college, and there was a man that helped me get into that college, Mr. George Nykerk. He said, "What are you doing now, Bill?" I said, "Oh, I've got 9 months till I go into the service." He said, "Would you like to come down here and work for me in the George Marshall Research Foundation?" I said, "I'll call my dad up and tell him I'm not coming over." I did call my dad, and he said, "Bill, you're a DeMolay alumni, I guess." He said, "You're set in September, October, and November for your degrees. You better be here for them." So I commuted 3 months in a row on Tuesday nights, the second Tuesday, to take my degrees and have my Inter Apprentice Fellowcraft and Master Mason degree in 1961. Then I went on active duty in the Army. I did go to some lodge meetings, but not a lot. I joined the reserve unit when I came out of the service. Sean and I lived in a place called Brooklyn, New York. Went to a couple of lodge meetings. My reserve unit was on Miller Field in Staten Island. Pretty good. That was a good ride. Then we moved to to Park Ridge, and my reserve unit moved to Tappan. And they sent out a sign looking for people to help assist opening up this George Washington's headquarters, the DeWitt House. And I went there. I shouldn't tell the story because Ron Steiner's not here, but Ron was his chairman. And I went up and said, "I'd like to help you out, opening up headquarters." And Ron said, "You have to be a Mason." He saw my jersey plates. I said, "I am a Mason." "You have to be a New York Mason." "Garden City, Ron." "You have to be a member of this lodge." And that's how I got started in Masonry, with the DeWitt House, coming up here, helping in the library, and ever since then, it's been exciting. I became an active brother of Masonry. This action, besides having me attend lodge, introduced me to this fine library, and getting the DeWitt House open to research, my interest in history, and especially Masonic history, soared. In Washington and the Bi-Centennial is a great way to be introduced to Masonic history. But the historical period we're going to talk about doesn't leave much to be desired. The Depression of 1929 through the Bi-Centennial of 1932 does not emphasize the good life in America. What I'd like to do tonight is to talk about the bright and shiny Bi-Centennial celebration. And then if we have time, if you're still awake, and if I can still talk, we can move down to visit Washington, D.C. at the same time, what was called the Bonus March. As Masons, we are very proud of our lodges, our heritage, our brothers, our actions within Freemasonry. We turn to history and find Masons who have set the example with their lives, and use that phrase certainly to seek those who are asking for admission to our lodges, that Masonry exists to make good men better. Beautiful. Imagine the success of Freemasonry if each of us could illustrate our fraternity and to the whole world, all working together as a whole. Might we find one brother who stands out in our country's history? We could then promote a year to telling his great story. To help make his example reach more people, we could spread his story through lectures, articles, publication, plays, stamps, paintings, and souvenirs. That would tell all about him and demonstrate how his Masonic experiences have helped our lives and theirs. And that is what happened on George Washington's 200th birthday in 1932. We cannot ask for a better example than George Washington. So let's have a party. Congress chose 2 men to lead this idea and to serve on the Bi-Centennial Committee. First came Ulysses S Grant III. Wow. the son of Frederick Dent Grant and grandson of General and President Ulysses S. Grant. Born on the 4th of July, 1881. In 1898, he received an appointment to West Point with Grandpa. He graduated 6th with his classmate, Douglas MacArthur, who graduated 1st in the class of 1903. And their diplomas were presented by Elihu Root, who was then Secretary of War. Upon graduation, Grant served as an aide to Teddy Roosevelt. 3 years later, Grant met his wife, Edith Root, who was then Secretary of State while Grant was working at the White House. When World War I broke out, he was promoted to major, served on General Bliss's staff, and in 1918 assisted in the treaty negotiation regarding the treatment of prisoners of war. And when the war ended, Grant worked on President Wilson's commission to negotiate peace in Paris. When he returned to Washington, he was the executive, now look at this list, the executive officer of the Arlington Memorial Bridge Commission, a member of the National Capital Park and Planning Commission, director of the newly created Office of Public Buildings and Public Parks, and was promoted to lieutenant colonel in 1927. Fine choice to have him on the committee. Well, that's not exactly what's good in the country. When the stock market crash of October 24, 1929 took place, it sent Wall Street into a panic and wiped out millions of investors. The world suffered the Great Depression then from 1929 to say 1939, and this was the worst economic turndown in the history of the industrialized world. But in this part of our presentation, the planning for the Washington Bi-Centennial was well underway. And that leads us on February 18, 1930, to the announcement of the other in command, Brother Saul Bloom. This is a quote. It was announced here today by Senator Simon D. Fest and Representative John Q. Tilson, both of them are brother Masons. On behalf of the Executive Committee of the George Washington Bi-Centennial Commission, that Congressman Saul Bloom of New York as an appointed Associated Director along with Lieutenant Colonel Grant for the celebration in 1932. All right, now we've heard how good General Grant is, or Colonel Grant is. Let's take a look at Saul. Well, Saul's background for this prestigious position. Legal papers say he was born March 9, 1870, and that is really just a guess. Bloom acknowledged in his autobiography that his exact date of birth is unknown. He was the son of Gershon, later anglicized to Garrison, and Sarah Bloom, Orthodox Jewish immigrants from service in Prussia, Poland. Saul was the youngest of 6 children. His parents came to the United States before the Civil War. Bloom was moved to San Francisco in 1873, and according to Bloom, his formal education lasted 1 day, and his mother taught him how to read and write. Whoa. He worked at odd jobs in and around the theater and made quite a name for himself. In 1889, Bloom went to Paris to an exposition there. And he got some great ideas the way the people were in the exhibit were going on. There were dances that were formed, and in no sense disorderly or a vulgar dance. Got that written down here. Then he received his big break. Bloom was hired as the entertainment director of the Chicago World's Colombian Exposition. This is what it looked like, celebrating the 400th anniversary of some guy named Christopher Columbus. Bloom came up with one of its major attractions, called the Streets of Cairo, which included the famous dancer Little Egypt, snake charmers, and camel rides. Well, the newspapers took a crack at what he was doing and called it North African belly dancers, and said that Saul reinvented the hoochie coochie dance. Well, he did write a song called The Streets of Cairo, for the poor little country maid. Okay, now ladies, don't listen here. Whose century-old lyrics had been traditionally sung by young men as, oh, they don't wear pants on the sunny side of you know what you said, okay. In this prestigious role, he made more money than the President of the United States, $1,000 a week. Bloom is now in his early 20s. Soon he became the Chicago branch manager of M. Whitmark and Sons, the largest publisher of sheet music in the United States, and by 1896 was publishing under his own name. In 1897, he married Evelyn Hetzheimer and settled in a fashionable district in South Prairie Avenue in Chicago, billing himself as Saul Bloom, the music man. Sounds fun. At the turn of the 20th century, he was awarded the first musical copyright of the new century for I Wish I Was in Dixieland Tonight by a guy, Raymond A. Brown. Well, Solomon Bloom now became a Mason. He stated his occupation as an entertainment impresario and sheet music publisher. He petitioned Kenwood Lodge 800 and later merged with Elmhurst 71 in Cottage Hill, Illinois, a suburb of Chicago. On July 31st, 1899, his degrees followed on September 11th, fellowcraft on the 18th, mastermation on September 25th. 3 years later, on December 22nd, 1902, he demitted and moved to New York City. Now in 1903, he became a member of Pacific Lodge 233, today's Second Manhattan. Now this lodge had a number, anybody? Anybody from?
Our district.
Oh, good, okay, good. This lodge had a number of actors and musicians at that time. One of them, along, was George M. Cohan. We'll see him later. And Bloom, he liked people. He was a member of Scottish Rite. The Shrine was a moose, a red man, and an elk. Wow. All right. Oh, he's going to be competitive with this General Grant, I'm sure. When he moved to New York City, he began dabbling in real estate. He expanded his national chain of department store music departments and sold Victor talking machines. You've seen that. The record player with the dog looking at it. His real estate investments made him a fortune. Now, Representative-elect Samuel Marks of New York's 19th Congressional District passed away, got elected before he took office. And Bloom switched from being a Republican to the Democrats' Tammany Hall. You remember that? They ruled New York City. Bloom was invited to run and won this usually Republican silk stocking district of Manhattan's Upper East Side by a slim 145 votes. Who are you? Okay. Saul wrote in his autobiography that on election eve, his friend and Senator Royal S. Colton spoke up for him in a rally of his Orthodox friends. Quote, "It was a wonderful little speech right up to the end. Then he wound up with, and with your loyal support, I confidently predict that by this time tomorrow, your good friend and mine, Saul Bloom, will have brought home the bacon." Saul concludes with, there are some things that even a United States Senator should be careful. He then entered the 6-8 Congress on March 4th, 1923, re-elected the 6th, and he served for the next 12 succeeding Congresses. Get back to 1930. Bloom notes that we had less than 2 years in which to prepare for the biggest birthday celebration in history. Not much had been planned prior to their appointments. Despite assurance from President Herbert Hoover and other leaders that the economic crisis would run its course, matters continued to get worse for the next 3 years. The year is 1930. 4 million Americans would be looking for work. That number would rise to 6 million in the year 1931. 2 years into the Great Depression. The Bi-Centennial couldn't have been planned for a better time to improve the nation's morale. On Monday, June 16th, Saul entered a speech on the record of the 71st Congress that he had given on Thursday over the NBC radio a few days before. Bloom began his talk on George Washington with this key statement. To understand George Washington and what he means to America of today, we must think of him as a man, not as an ideal. I'd like to give you some of the points of Saul's plan and show how they were completed. The federal government has authorized the publication of all of the definitive writings of George Washington, which will be published in a memorial edition in approximately 25 volume. I think this one's 39. Okay. All right, so turn that some more. The George Washington Masonic National Memorial was dedicated on May 12, 1932. Planners had hoped for a dedication date of February 22nd in honor of Washington's birthday, but the structure was not ready in time, as many of the interior details had not been agreed on or installed. Electrical and plumbing work had not reached the third floor, and the George Washington National Bi-Centennial Commission had already scheduled numerous programs for February. Initially, May 13th, that's the 325th anniversary of the founding of the English settlement at Jamestown, was chosen as another date for the dedication. But since the number 13 is considered unlucky, we dedicated it on May 12th. New York Grand Lodge sent representatives. Our Grand Masters in the middle here. The Great Memorial Boulevard between Washington and Mount Vernon was to be under construction. It's going to be one of the most beautiful highways of the world. There it is. Today you recognize that. And that also made a regional park system for the national capital, unsurpassed in America. It was now authorized by Congress as a George Washington Memorial Parkway. This great parkway includes some of the beautiful historic places with which Washington has been intimately defined. Congress has also established Wakefield. This is the birthplace in Virginia as a national park. It was knocked down, and they will re-erect it upon that site as a replica of the house where Washington was born. Now Saul comes up with some other ideas. This is all his. In our plans, it is proposed to foster in all parts of the country local, regional, and state celebrations. These celebrations, the people themselves will organize and take part in them. It is hoped that in 1932, there will not be a schoolroom or school building in the United States without its pictures of George Washington. It is hoped there will not be a school or a church or a home that will not display the American flag with appropriate reminders of what it means in our national life. It is proposed to hold essay contests, pageants, plays, and exercises of all similar kinds in public schools. Good. In like manner, we want to enlist the cooperation of all clubs, associations, fraternal organizations, and miscellaneous groups of people. Quote, let us now dedicate in our hearts the memory of this man. Let us resolve that we shall do him honor and reverence for what he was and what he has given to us. I leave you with this appeal tonight as Americans all in the freedom and enlightenment which George Washington brought into the world. That's pretty serious talk. And then there was a joke. I just found this recently. I thought this was really bad. A Swiss sculptor by the name of Ernest Dury, guy on the left, had the grand idea that George Washington, the biggest name in American history, should have the biggest statue in his honor. So he proceeded to make a colossal bust weighing about 9 tons and standing fully 12 feet high. Great. He telephoned the unsuspecting Swiss minister, Mark Peter, on the right side, to request him to petition the White House how to give and present this gift to President Hoover. The poor minister, Swiss minister, had no idea what the word bust would encompass, and he wanted to show Swiss art in the country. So they set this up to be near the executive offices to make the presentation. After the two had left, President Hoover called his secretary and said, hey, I guess we'll have to turn this over to Saul Bloom. Call Saul and tell him to come pick it up. Saul sent a message by cab, and Secretary Johnson asked if the young man could take it back in a taxi. Or better yet, go ask Bloom to come over here himself and see what he can do with it. Being briefed on the situation by the young man, Saul showed up and said, what's all the excitement about? This isn't so big. And then he rented the biggest truck in Washington, D.C. to carry it away. He spent the whole next day calling every storage company in town to find somebody who would take this. It stayed in oblivion for several months and then was sent to the auditorium in Atlantic City. Now, where did I get that story? From an article written by Vera, his daughter, back in 1944. And she closes it with this comment: "For all I know, it is still there." Well, you don't do that to me. So I looked all through, and I got a couple of notes from no, nobody knows where it is, so if you do see it. The interesting thing about the story is this sculptor used to claim that he was the last student of Rodin. You know, the artist did a lot of drawings. And all the proof that he really had was a picture of him and Rodin, like being the Grand Master. You know, that didn't work. And it turned out in the 1950s, I guess, that they found out that he was forging his Rodin stuff. He did a good job on the sculpture. For the series of these books put out, there's two of them, Honor to George Washington, both men wrote their skills and experience. Lieutenant Colonel Grant's contribution was pamphlet number 13, Washington as Engineer and City Builder, and covered Washington's founding and the capital city of Bears' name. And pamphlet number 12 is Washington, the Businessman, written by Saul Bloom. Okay, so they're working hard on that. In Saul's biography, he wrote that in January 1931, Colonel Grant was, quote, compelled by the pressures of his military duties to retire as associate director, and I found myself in completely charge of the work, end of quote. Well, that might not be exactly the way it worked out. A New Yorker magazine, issue of February 20th, 1932, puts this spin on it. Grant leader. Republican senators on the commission had some doubt about Bloom's ability to meet the demands of the situation, and insisted on the appointment of Colonel U.S. Grant. Saul raised no objection, but the colonel's tenure of office was brief. When he showed signs of having ideals of his own, markedly less flamboyant than Saul's, Colonel Grant soon found himself so outmaneuvered that there was nothing left for him to do but resign, which he did. This dispatch with which Saul disposed of the colonel left the commission somewhat breathless. By the time he was in full sway, the commission could only blink and look on in silence. By then the world was in the mood for the party. Washington's name began to appear in projects other than the academic field. Now, I got a kick at this. One name placement was a surprise. A bridge that had begun in September 1927 from New York to New Jersey was to be dedicated in 1932. You guys know what bridge I'm talking about, right? The 1932 dedication could be changed, and it was to be called the Hudson River Bridge. There are already 25 bridges in the country named after Washington. That's not a bad idea, the Hudson River Bridge. Then ballot boxes went up on both sides of the river in January, February, March of 1931. Tens of thousands of citizens cast their votes. Hudson River Bridge was the most popular. Palisades Bridge trailed behind. Even there was 169th Street Bridge. That makes sense. There were vigorous boosters for Interstate Bridge, Knickerbocker Bridge, Admiral Farragut Bridge, all were proposed. There even was some guy from Brooklyn named Levy who mounted an earnest campaign to get the bridge named after him. Votes were cast for Al Smith and the Charles Lindbergh Bridge. In April, the results went back to Port Authority. On October 24th, 1931, so 9 months earlier than planned, and for far less funding, by the way, the longest bridge in the country, the Hudson River Bridge, was to be formally dedicated. Okay, cutting the ribbon at the dedication ceremony was the governor of New York, Brother Franklin D. Roosevelt, and representing New Jersey was governor and brother from Raritan Lodge over there, 61, Morgan Foster Lawson, and accordingly wrote, quote, the New York Times, the bridge naming committee stuck with the name George Washington Bridge and, quote, declined to make public the nature of its decision. Hey, come on. Roosevelt was also the first honorary Grand Master of DeMolay. Write that down. Some months later, officials of the Bi-Centennial Committee called on the White House to confirm the name change. Okay. Hoping the New York, New Jersey GW Bridge was also a gift to New York Masons with something a little different. New York's Masonic outlook carried the story in January 1932 that the new road from the George Washington Bridge up to Nyack, New York, on the New Jersey side, would increase traffic and property values. The article announced that Washington's headquarters in the DeWitt House in Tappan on the New York-New Jersey border, where General Washington made his headquarters 4 times, was for sale. The article added that some patriotic societies had considered buying the property back in 1879, and that the New York legislature had entertained bills to take possession of the property, but politics had interfered. At the news of this possibility, New York Grandmaster Charles H. Johnson entered into negotiations to purchase the property. Never, he declared, were Washington's headquarters at Tappan risk being padlocked. He sent his own check as a binder on the property, and on November 21st, he signed the purchase contract. He then at Grand Lodge presented what he had done and received the funding needed and the fraternity's total back. Now, when I was doing research, I was looking for the portrait of Grandmaster Johnson. I asked Rich Bateman, and he said it was in the Grand Secretary's office. Well, because after he was Grand Master, he was the Grand Secretary. I asked to see it, and I was with our library trustee, Right Worshipful Ed Shiani, who took this picture, and I thought I'd share that. Okay. On November 5th, 1931, Pacific Lodge, downstairs, 233, observed the Masonic birthday of Washington with appropriate ceremonies at the New York Grand Lodge Masonic Temple. The brothers joined in singing patriotic songs that included the latest song of Brother George M. Cohen, Father of the Land We Love. And it was written especially for Bi-Centennial. I tried to get the music working here. We get it. Honorable Saul Bloom was the principal speaker. Upon the occasion of this visit to the Pacific Lodge, Bloom was greeted with enthusiasm by his brothers and inspired them with a most informing address on the hero whom the country honors during this bicentennial. And again, Cohen and Bloom both were members of the lodge. I spoke to this a couple of minutes ago with one of you. Paintings and prints of George Washington are always a favorite of Masons. This one is done with a Revolutionary War theme, was John Ward Dunsmore. If you ever get a chance down at Francis Tavern, they have a great display of Dunsmore's paintings. So 5 or 6 years earlier, Dunsmore had painted the petition showing the Masons meeting in Morristown in 1779. They pictured the lodge discussing an idea to elect His Excellency as the Grand Master and set up a national United States of America lodge. Washington is pictured over there on the left, leaning on his cane, listening to speakers. And this is found to this day in some lodges. When Right Worshipful Harry Leroy Haywood was editor of the New York Masonic Outlook from 1925-1930, he commissioned Dunsmore to paint Washington as the master of his lodge. Dunsmore, always striving for accuracy, visited Alexandria Lodge and dressed a model in the clothes that Washington had worn, set him out on the master's dais and with the very furniture that Washington had used. This picture, Washington's Master's Lodge, was the cover of the New York Masonic Outlook, February 1927. Saul Bloom, this is his collection of proposals for the stamp collection. Bloom took pride in his agency's insistence on realism. In consultation with F. Walter Mueller, and Mueller was a member of Century Lodge in South Orange, New Jersey, Bloom reviewed many Masonic portraits of Washington before them, rejecting them all as inaccurate. He then hired Hattie Burdett to create a portrait. And these are portraits that Harry had done. Her portraits were based on the Howden statue of Washington, while the overall work incorporated the relics maintained by Alexander Washington, Lodge number 22. Hattie was unusual in that she would copy famous portraits from photographs, as well as then paint portraits of her contemporaries with a high degree of accuracy. Termed a strong and dignified interpretation of character, her portraits were original and they were not a copy of an existing portrait or of a single photograph, but were composed by the artist of a number of different sources. Oh, but it's not exactly a picture of Washington. Yeah, it's a picture of the Howden statue, yes, and the male model for it was an actor, William Teff Johnson. Johnson had a full silent movie career. He was the star director and in charge of scenery for a movie, Sonny Jim at the Mardi Gras. And working again with Bloom on September 17, 1932, he portrayed His Excellency Washington during a reenactment of the Washington laying of the cornerstone. And that was filmed by the Washington Bi-Centennial Committee. Had he followed Dunsmore lead by contacting Washington's home lodge, now Alexandria, Washington 22, and arranged for permission to paint Taft with the Washington apron, Grand Master mentioned it, the Watson Pursuit apron, along with the Master's jewel, and she posed Taft in the east. In the painting behind the worshipful Master is a leather high-back chair that you saw in that other painting that did belong to Washington, which was given later to the lodge, but was not in the lodge when Washington was there. The pedestal and the canopy were also later additions to the lodge. As well as appearing repeatedly both in the Masonic press and in publications of the Bi-Centennial Commission, more than 1,500 photolithic reproductions of Burdett's painting were distributed by congressmen to Masonic lodges throughout the country. Anybody have one in their lodge? There you go. Thank you. It would be yours. The original painting, now on display at the George Washington Masonic Memorial in Alexandria, originally hung in Bloom's office and was given to the Masonic Memorial the year following the death of Bloom's wife in 1941. Okay, how about a painting for every school in America? The next choice was slightly easier for Bloom. He picked a painting was well known and was a classic before the original was even dry. This was to be the portrait of Washington by Stuart. As one of the last of 3 original portraits of Washington, painted in 1796, it was not completed, and Stuart refused to give it up to Washington or the family, and used it to make copies for the rest of his life to make a living. The painting has been accepted as a standard bearer and was placed in every school in the United States by the Bi-Centennial Commission. Wow. Anybody remember that from school? Thank you. I have one home that my aunt, who was a history teacher when she retired, put in her basement, which I retired. Okay. For stamp collecting and to have some income raised within the project, 12 postage stamps, got them over here, with pictures throughout Washington's career were chosen by the Postmaster General and then submitted by the Bi-Centennial Committee from the many available pictures. First day covers was such that a series would materially add to the knowledge of Washington and add a special educational and inspirational value. I wrote this note up here. You should see this note here to Maurer. My dear Maurer, I'm sending you greetings from Mount Vernon, 200th anniversary of Washington. 200 years from now, this may be of some value. If you see it, take a look at it in 2132. Sincerely, he's the postman. And look at how she opened it. She didn't know that. Miss Muriel had no idea what Postmaster Swanson meant this note. Here are some of the pamphlets put out, just a few of the many. Here are the guides. Oh, we'll do that. We consider an average of 16,000 individual bicentennial programs by churches, schools, civic bodies, patriotic societies, and fraternal orders were held in all parts of the United States each day, January through September or October, depending where you were, totaling 4,760,345 separate and distinct programs. It is readily realized that only the highlights of the Bi-Centennial could be touched upon in this report, and that's from Saul's report, not mine. At Fredericksburg Lodge number 4, Free and Accepted Masons on November 4th, the date that also marked the 100th anniversary of the initiation of Washington Masonry. Back then, 20 years, that's right, 20 years, you could become a Mason. And he did it on his birthday. Took place. Nearby attracted many thousand Masonic visitors to the city, and this event also brought to a close the formal bicentennial activities at Fredericksburg. In addition to Washington, another member of the same lodge, James Monroe, would later become a president. At the closing ceremony, adjacent to the altar, was the record book that showed the initiation, passing, and raising in the local lodge of President Washington. The members of the lodge were all in colonial costume. Over 2,000 Masons attended. More than 20 states were represented. Scottish Rite, provided a Masonic play, John Brent, acted on by brothers from Richmond, and this part of the program was open to the general public. George Washington to become a Mason, that's what the newspaper says. This Washington is an ancestor somehow. He lived in Milford, Virginia. He was going to be raised in the farm where Washington was born. And he was made a Mason in Fredericksburg, Virginia on November 4th, 1752. And as my old professor would say, that's a researchable project. There were so many collectibles during the bicentennial. Anyone have any home? They were all Washington related, usually told a story. Hey, but the sales raised money. The books gave genuine information on Washington. And that spilled up to correcting a lot of the myths and stories in the early politics of the founding of the nation. There were also Masonic celebrations across the country. This is in New York, Mason. They put out clip sheets. This was a neat deal. These were daily news, well, the New York Times newspapers. They were weekly, sent out to individuals and to organizations, and you had your name in that. This one was the one on stamps. There were pageants in lodges and in schools. This one is this is in Anderson. There were plays in many different venues. There were colonial balls. Now, this wasn't done by everybody. This is Saul's daughter, his only child, Vera. She wrote a book called My Time in Washington in 1944. Daddy's been there 20 some odd years, and she was brought up there. But they were usually by wealthier families, wealthier groups. There were many reenactments. Here's New York. These are all from New York City. Somehow I thought that was down near NYU, but that could be changed. And there were letters of thanks and congratulations. And this one is from Franklin D. to Saul, pointing it out. The one I like is this one, from some guy named Will Rogers. I think Will Rogers was a Mason too. My dear friend Saul, I don't know if I ever did write you what a fine work you did on the Washington Bi-Centennial. I know I mentioned in my articles, but Congressman never reads the paper, so I will have to write you this letter. You had to be an historian, a salesman, a diplomat, and a bandit to get the money out of Congress to do it on, but you did it. The only guy ever made a party run 9 months, and you did it in dry times too, no booze. Saul, you made this whole country Washington conscious. We had just pictured him as a Mason, as a man standing up in a boat when he ought to be sitting down. Oh, well, that's what Saul wrote. I'm going to let you read that if you do. There's much credited to the Bi-Centennial's success. There's also at the same time an historical event that brought change and brought new leadership to our country, the Veterans March on Washington that same summer. And that was followed by the election of President Brother Franklin D. Roosevelt, if we have time. Congressman Bloom later chaired the House Committee on Foreign Affairs in 1938. He was a strong supporter of Zionism. Bloom was also a delegate to the convention in San Francisco that established the United Nations. The first words of the preamble charter, "We the peoples of the United Nations," were suggested by Saul. He was one of 7 signers of the United Nations in San Francisco on June 6, 1945. Saul Bloom continued in office until his death on March 7, 1949. He was succeeded in Congress by Franklin Delano Roosevelt Jr. And Roosevelt was the principal speaker on the afternoon of June 17, 1951 at a memorial to 32nd degree Bloom that was unveiled in Mount Eden Cemetery, Valhalla, New York. Approximately 150 people attended the ceremony. Maurice M. Witherspoon, Director of Masonic Public Relations, Grand Lodge, and Frank Wittenberg, Master of Humanitas Lodge, number 1123, where Saul was an honorary member, was in charge of the Masonic rites. Saul was also the Grand Rep of the Grand Lodge of Cuba, near the Grand Lodge of New York. One more slide. The newspaper article that covered the memorial ceremony gave one further mention of Saul Bloom in Masonry. When the Bi-Centennial observances were over, Mr. Bloom found there was still a great deal of valuable material containing the Washington's Masonic life, which would be lost to history, if not properly preserved. Saul Bloom was now the Director General of the United States Sequicentennial Commission. That's the 200th anniversary of the Constitution. Check it out. I was acknowledged on the title page, the part taken by John H. Cowles, Grand Commander of the Southern Supreme Right Council of Scottish Rite. The result was a beautifully illustrated, documented 28-page, 9 by 12. The artistic cover bore the title, We the People. On the inside cover is the Hattie Burdett picture of George in his Masonic regalia. And on the fourth page, 2 pages of Masonic tribute, Masonic history of George Washington. Some 20,000 copies of that brochure were sent to the respective branch secretaries in the states, and it was requested 1 copy be sent to each symbolic lodge in their jurisdiction. The remainder was sold, and quote, there aren't any more to be had. Now, if anybody's up to, we've got a 6-minute film, I really want you to see that on the Washington March. Joseph, please. Sir? Oh, I think it'd be the same. Well, you looked at, I made a couple of notes here. His legacy, the Saul Bloom Playground of Manhattan, is named after his honor, on the west side. His papers are mostly in the New York Public Library. And we're not going to use that. That's the back of her book. Bloom lost a bet with Washington Senator's pitcher Walter Johnson after Johnson threw a silver dollar across Fredericksburg and across the Rappahannock River. And though the wager had been highly publicized, Bloom cited technicalities and refused to pay. Appreciate your help. Didn't mean to keep you this late. Why don't you write your own